This story is titled, My Alcoholic Wife Cheats on Me with Her Rehab Counselor. I Made Them Lose Everything. Hey, everyone! Before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now let's start the video. Ever spent over a decade of your life trying to save someone who clearly doesn't want to be saved? That was my marriage to Lisa, in short. 14 years of covering for her messes, paying for her mistakes, and watching her spiral, all while she played the victim. But don't worry, this story ends with me getting the last laugh. Let me walk you through how it all went down. Lisa and I met at a wedding when I was 25. She was the life of the party, commanding attention like it was owed to her. She had this energy about her, and yeah, I'll admit, I was drawn to it. I was in the early stages of building my software career, working long hours but pulling in decent money. Lisa worked in real estate, and her outgoing, talkative personality made her great at it. She could sell anything. We got married a year later. The first few years seemed good on the surface. Nice house, vacations, the usual. But there were cracks I didn't recognize back then. Lisa loved attention. She loved being noticed, whether by her friends, co-workers, or anyone she could charm in passing. That need for attention started to bleed into everything she did. Lisa also loved drinking. At first, it was 1 glass after work, then 2, then the whole bottle. She laughed it off when I brought it up. Everyone does it, she'd say. It's just a way to unwind. Back then, I thought she was just stressed from work. I didn't realize I was watching the beginning of a problem that would spiral completely out of control. When our first child, Jake, was born, I hoped it would ground her. And for a while, it seemed like it did. She'd show him off to friends and post all the cute baby pictures online, acting like she was mother of the year. But behind the scenes, it was a different story. I hired a nanny to help because Lisa was always too tired or too busy to deal with the hard parts of parenting. She claimed it was because she was working hard, but I started noticing she spent more time out with clients than actually closing deals. By the time the twins, Mia and Ellie, were born 3 years later, I was seeing the pattern. Lisa would make excuses, disappear for hours, and show up late to important events. I made sure we had help, nannies for the kids, someone to clean the house, because I wasn't about to play single dad on top of working full-time. Lisa, of course, didn't appreciate any of it. She acted like the hired help was a luxury instead of a necessity to compensate for her lack of involvement. The tipping point came 6 years ago. Lisa's drinking wasn't just a bad habit anymore. She'd stumble in late, slurring her words, and barely functioning the next day. I couldn't ignore it. I told her she needed help, and of course, she denied everything. "You're exaggerating," she snapped. "It's not a big deal." But it was a big deal, and I couldn't let it slide anymore. I paid $25,000 for rehab. Do you know what else we could have done with that money? But I was trying to save her, for the kids, and because I thought, stupidly, that she might actually want to be saved. Lisa went, and for a while, I thought it worked. She came out saying all the right things, promising to change, and for a couple of months, she actually tried. Then she slipped back into old habits. She said, "I can handle it. It's just 1 drink." Then it was 2, then 3. Before long, we were back to square one. I confronted her, and she turned it on me, accusing me of being controlling and too judgmental. Things got worse when I found out about a guy she was seeing. A friend of mine saw her out with some guy at a bar. When I confronted her, she denied it, of course. "He's just a friend," she said, laughing like it was no big deal. I didn't have proof at the time, so I let it go. But a week later, I found text messages on her phone. Flirty, inappropriate, and completely undeniable. When I showed her the evidence, she tried to downplay it. "It didn't mean anything," she said. "I was drunk. It was a mistake." I didn't forgive her because I was weak. I didn't forgive her at all. I stayed because of the kids. Jake was only 5, and the twins were just toddlers. Lisa's drinking and neglect were bad enough, and I didn't want them growing up in a broken home. I thought I could hold the family together. Lisa had underestimated me for years. She thought she could keep her double life under wraps, relying on my patience and the facade of being a perfect family to cover her tracks. What she didn't realize was that I wasn't just some clueless husband fumbling in the dark. 3 years ago, I hit my breaking point. The second I found out about Brian, I knew it was time to play my hand. Let me backtrack a little. When I first heard about Brian, it was from Lisa herself. After her drinking spiraled out of control and her behavior became impossible to ignore, I told her she needed professional help, or I was done. That's when she started seeing him, her guiding light, as she'd dramatically put it. She'd always gush about how he really understands what I'm going through and helps me feel seen. At first, I was relieved she was talking to someone about her issues. I thought it meant she was finally on the path to fixing herself, but something about the way she talked about him didn't sit right. She'd mention Brian in passing, but her face would light up when she did. And whenever I asked simple questions like, "How are the sessions going?" or "What's the plan for recovery?" she'd deflect. "It's private," she'd say. "You wouldn't understand." I brushed it off at first, thinking maybe she was just protective of her process. But as time went on, things got weirder. She started disappearing more frequently, always with some excuse about needing alone time to process. If I asked where she'd been, she'd get defensive. And her phone? Glued to her hand 24/7. She even started taking it to the bathroom, which she never used to do. I knew something was up, but I didn't have enough proof. Yet. The final straw came when I found that hotel charge. She'd been sloppy, leaving her email open on the shared laptop. I noticed the receipt immediately, and when I checked her GPS history, the story practically wrote itself. She wasn't just processing her feelings alone. She'd been meeting Brian at a hotel. Let me spell that out for you. She was sleeping with the guy I was paying to help her. The man who was supposed to guide her through her issues was part of the problem. I didn't confront her right away. No, I wanted to be smart about this. I started paying attention to everything she did. I checked her emails, her texts, and her calendar. I noticed patterns, gaps in her schedule that didn't add up, vague excuses that fell apart when I asked for details. Every piece of evidence I gathered felt like a small victory, a step closer to the truth. The turning point came one evening when Lisa told me she was going to a meeting. She left the house in a rush, barely saying goodbye, which was already suspicious. So I decided to follow her. I gave her a good head start, then hopped in my car and tracked her to, surprise, a hotel. I waited in the parking lot, watching as she walked inside. 10 minutes later, a man I assumed was Brian arrived. He was smug-looking, mid-40s, with a leather satchel that screamed, "I'm too cool for a briefcase." They didn't even bother sneaking around. They walked in together, laughing like teenagers. That was all I needed. I didn't go in or confront them. No, that would have been too easy. Instead, I went home and started building my case. The first thing I did was call my lawyer, Greg. Greg had been my go-to for years whenever I needed legal advice. But this was the first time I laid everything on the table. I told him about the drinking, the affairs, the neglect, and now this affair with Brian. His reaction? "This is gold," he said. "Not just because it's an affair, but because of who Brian is. A relationship between a counselor and a patient is a huge ethical breach. We're going to use this." I let Greg take the lead while I continued gathering evidence. I went through bank statements, emails, and old texts, pulling together every shred of proof I could find. Meanwhile, Lisa carried on, as if nothing was wrong. She had no idea what I was planning, and honestly, that made it so much sweeter. The moment that sealed it for me was when I found an email chain between Lisa and Brian. They weren't even careful about it. Flirty messages back and forth, sprinkled with inappropriate comments about their private sessions. It made my stomach turn, but it was exactly what I needed. I forwarded everything to Greg, who practically jumped out of his chair when he saw it. "This isn't just proof of an affair," Greg said. "This could ruin his career. You're sitting on a gold mine." The next step was filing a formal complaint with the state licensing board. It was about Brian taking advantage of his position as a licensed professional. Meanwhile, I kept my poker face on at home. Lisa still thought she was in control, spinning her lies and living her double life. She didn't realize that every time she left the house, I was one step closer to blowing up her little fantasy world. I knew she'd try to play the victim once everything came to light. That's how she'd always operated, twisting every situation to make herself look innocent and me look like the bad guy. But this time, I wasn't giving her the chance. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for my kids, who deserved a stable home, and a parent who actually cared about them. The first crack in Lisa's armor came when Greg officially filed the complaint. The board didn't waste any time launching an investigation. Brian, of course, had no idea what was coming, and neither did Lisa. I played dumb, letting them think they were getting away with it while the walls started closing in. The complaint to the board wasn't just a move against Brian. It was leverage in the divorce. Greg made it clear that we'd use the ethical breach to weaken Lisa's position. Her lawyer wouldn't be able to argue for custody or a big settlement if we had proof of her recklessness and irresponsibility. What made it even better was how confident Lisa still was. She'd waltz into the house like nothing was wrong, acting like her lies weren't unraveling by the second. I didn't say a word, just nodded along while she dug her own grave. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one scrambling to fix things. I was the one in control, watching as the house of lies Lisa had built came crashing down. My lawyer, Greg, and I started strategizing for the divorce. Greg was sharp, and he didn't just want to win. He wanted to leave Lisa with nothing more than she deserved. The ethical breach from her affair with Brian wasn't just an emotional betrayal, it was a professional disaster. Brian had violated every rule in the book. And Lisa, she'd handed me the perfect weapon to take her down. First, Greg suggested we start by tightening the financial noose. Lisa had always treated our finances like a bottomless ATM. Shopping sprees, luxury dinners, and let's not forget the $25,000 I'd spent on her rehab. She acted like money just fell out of the sky. But she wasn't paying attention to the fact that I'd already started separating our finances months earlier. I opened a new account in my name and moved most of my income there. I left enough in the joint account to cover the basics, but nothing else. Lisa barely noticed. She was too busy living her fantasy life with Brian to pay attention. Meanwhile, I stopped funding her escapades. No more dinners on my dime, no more mystery hotel receipts. Next, I quietly started documenting everything. Every time she came home late, every missed school event, every morning she slept off another night out. I wrote it all down with dates, times, and details. Greg told me this would be crucial in court, especially when it came to showing her neglect as a parent. The hardest part? Keeping a straight face around Lisa. Every time she smiled at me, thinking she still had me fooled, I wanted to laugh. But I kept my cool. I let her think everything was fine while the damage was already done. The licensing board moved fast. Within weeks of filing the complaint, they reached out to me for more information. Greg and I handed over everything. The hotel receipts, the emails, even the timeline of their so-called therapy sessions. Lisa had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. Brian, on the other hand, must have started to feel the heat, because I noticed Lisa was spending less time at sessions and more time pacing around the house, glued to her phone. One night, she sat me down. She tried to sound casual, but her voice had that edge she got whenever she was nervous. "Have you been talking to anyone about us?" she asked, avoiding eye contact. "Why do you ask?" I replied, pretending to be clueless. "It's just, people are saying things," she stammered, "and Brian's been dealing with some professional issues. I just don't want anything getting out of hand." That was the first crack. For the first time, Lisa wasn't the one in control. She was scrambling, trying to figure out what was happening, but I wasn't giving her any clues. "I haven't said anything," I said calmly. "Why? Is there something I should know?" She didn't answer, just gave me a tight smile and walked away. Meanwhile, Greg and I kept building our case. The next step was child custody. Lisa loved to talk about how much she cared about the kids, but her actions told a different story. She'd missed Jake's last parent-teacher conference, blew off Mia and Ellie's school play, and barely spent time with them when she was home. Instead, she'd retreat to the bedroom or the backyard with her phone, leaving the nanny and me to handle everything. Greg made it clear. Custody was ours to win. The more evidence we had of Lisa's neglect, the stronger our case would be. Then came the moment everything started to unravel. The licensing board sent Brian a formal notice about the complaint. I didn't know exactly what went down, but I can only imagine the panic that must have set in. One day, Lisa stormed into the house, furious. "Are you trying to ruin my life?" she screamed. I raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about? Brian got a complaint. Someone's trying to sabotage him. He could lose his license." She was practically foaming at the mouth, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. I shrugged. "Sounds like a professional issue. Nothing to do with me." She glared at me, trying to gauge if I was lying. "I swear, if you're involved—" "You swear what, Lisa?" I interrupted, my voice calm but firm. "Because last I checked, you're the one sneaking around and blowing up our family. Don't pin this on me." She froze, her face draining of color. For the first time, she realized I wasn't the oblivious husband she'd been treating me as. From that point on, things got ugly. Lisa became more erratic, lashing out at me and the kids over the smallest things. She'd stomp around the house, slamming doors and muttering under her breath. Meanwhile, Greg filed the divorce paperwork. We went in strong, full custody of the kids, the house, and minimal financial support for Lisa. When Lisa got served, she completely lost it. She threw the papers on the floor and screamed at me like I'd committed the ultimate betrayal. "You're trying to destroy me," she shouted. "No, Lisa," I said, my voice steady. "You destroyed yourself. I'm just cleaning up the mess." When Lisa's lawyer drafted the divorce terms, they were desperate to protect Brian from any fallout. By then, I think they were both starting to realize how serious the complaint I'd filed with the licensing board really was. Lisa's lawyer, probably on her insistence, added a clause in the divorce negotiations. I was prohibited from speaking negatively about Brian or their relationship to anyone. They thought this would silence me and keep Brian safe while the divorce moved forward. But here's the thing about legal agreements. They're only as good as the specifics. What Lisa's lawyer failed to consider was whether I'd already filed a formal complaint about Brian before signing the divorce papers. They assumed my bad-mouthing was just me talking to neighbors or friends, venting about how Lisa's life had gone off the rails. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't just complaining. I was taking real, actionable steps to hold Brian accountable. You see, a gag order only applies to what you do after the agreement is in place. It can't erase the steps you've already taken. And a subpoena? That's a whole other level. Subpoenas legally compel you to testify in investigations or court proceedings, and they override any prior agreements, including divorce settlements. Greg made sure I was crystal clear on that when we filed the complaint. He had this sly grin when he explained it to me. They'll think they're clever, but a subpoena trumps everything, he said. You'll just need to sit tight and let the board come to you. So I waited, quietly. I didn't tell Lisa about the complaint or that the licensing board had already reached out for details. I didn't fight the gag order during the divorce proceedings either. There was no need. I let her and her lawyer think they'd boxed me in, that I couldn't say a word about Brian. When the subpoena arrived, Greg and I were ready. By this point, the board's investigation was well underway. They'd reviewed the evidence we submitted. They'd already pieced together the unprofessional and unethical nature of their relationship, but they needed me to confirm everything under oath. The timing was perfect. The divorce had just moved into its final stages, and Lisa was still strutting around like she'd won some great battle, thinking the gag order had silenced me. She had no idea the licensing board had subpoenaed me. When Greg told me the subpoena had arrived, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and relief. For years, Lisa had played the victim, twisting every situation to her advantage. She'd acted like her choices didn't have consequences, but now she couldn't hide behind legal tricks or manipulation. On the day of the hearing, I sat across from the licensing board and laid it all out. I didn't hold back. I described how Lisa had started seeing Brian during a difficult time, how their therapy sessions quickly turned into something entirely inappropriate, and how their relationship had caused further damage to our already fragile marriage. I explained how Brian had violated every ethical standard of his profession by exploiting a vulnerable client for his personal gain. The board members didn't even try to hide their disgust. They asked a few follow-up questions to clarify details, but honestly, the evidence spoke for itself. Brian didn't stand a chance. By the time I left the hearing, I knew Brian's career was over. It didn't take long for the decision to come through. The board revoked his license permanently and added his name to a public registry of sanctioned professionals. He was finished, and there was no coming back from it. When Lisa found out, she was furious. Not just because Brian had lost his career, but because she finally realized how badly she'd miscalculated. That gag order she'd fought so hard for? Useless. She hadn't just lost control of the narrative. She'd handed me the tools to tear it apart. Greg couldn't have been happier. This is exactly why we didn't push back on the gag order during negotiations, he said. Letting them think they had the upper hand worked in our favor. They walked right into the trap. During the initial negotiations of the divorce process, Lisa was laser-focused on protecting Brian. She thought the gag order was her biggest win, and her lawyer put all their energy into making sure I couldn't speak negatively about their relationship. What she didn't realize was that I was already 5 steps ahead. While she was busy protecting her boyfriend, I was securing everything else. The house, full custody of the kids, and a financial agreement that worked entirely in my favor. Her lawyer didn't catch it because they were too distracted trying to play defense. They missed the fact that the settlement left Lisa with almost nothing. Sure, she got a small payout, but it was barely enough to cover a few months of her lifestyle. Meanwhile, I kept the house, my savings, and full control of the kids' future. By the time Lisa realized what had happened, it was too late. She'd already signed the papers. When the court officially finalized the divorce, I packed her bags and told her it was time to go. She looked at me like I'd just slapped her. "You can't just kick me out," she said, her voice trembling. "Actually, I can," I said. "This house is mine now. You signed the papers. It's not my problem where you go from here." She tried to argue, but the fight was gone from her. She knew she didn't have a leg to stand on. With nowhere else to go, Lisa moved in with Brian. It was almost poetic. Her entire world had crumbled, and now she was stuck living with the guy who had helped her ruin everything. I couldn't help but feel a grim sense of satisfaction knowing she was reaping the consequences of her choices. Brian's career was in shambles, thanks to the licensing board's decision to revoke his credentials. His name was plastered on the public registry of sanctioned professionals, which made it impossible for him to find work in his field. Nobody wants to hire a disgraced counselor who violated the most basic ethical boundaries. Even worse, the fallout had reached beyond his professional life. His reputation in the community was destroyed. Mutual friends and neighbors wanted nothing to do with him. Lisa, for her part, had burned every bridge she had. She used to have a wide circle of acquaintances from her days in real estate, but those connections dried up as her drinking and unreliability became common knowledge. She'd flaked on too many deals, broken too many promises, and left too many people in the lurch. Even her own family had distanced themselves. They'd been sympathetic at first, but years of excuses, outbursts, and entitlement had finally pushed them away. By the time she packed her things and left my house, Lisa had no options left. She couldn't afford an apartment of her own, and no one was offering her a couch to crash on. Moving in with Brian wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. From what I heard through mutual acquaintances, their living situation was far from glamorous. Brian had a small, dingy apartment in an older part of town, nothing like the spacious home Lisa had grown used to. Gone were the days of fancy dinners and designer handbags. Instead, Lisa found herself stuck in a cramped one-bedroom unit with a man who couldn't pay his rent on time, let alone offer her the lifestyle she'd once enjoyed. They didn't even have enough money to cover basic expenses. Brian's unemployment hit them hard. He tried to find work in other fields. He applied for administrative positions, customer service jobs, even a teaching role at a community college. But every application was met with rejection. His name on that registry was a scarlet letter that followed him everywhere he went. And Lisa? She didn't have the skills or the work ethic to bring in an income herself. Lisa had always been good at projecting an image of success, but without money or status to back her up, the cracks in her facade became painfully obvious. She spent her days lounging around Brian's apartment, scrolling through social media, and complaining about how unfair life was. At first, I'm sure she thought she could lean on him for support, but the truth was, Brian was just as lost as she was. Their relationship, which had once been so passionate and exciting, started to deteriorate under the weight of their shared failures. They fought constantly, with Lisa blaming Brian for ruining everything. She accused him of being careless, of dragging her into his mess, and of not doing enough to fix their situation. Brian, on the other hand, started to see her for what she really was, a self-centered, entitled woman who brought more problems than solutions. The argument spilled out into the hallway of their apartment building, where neighbors could hear every bitter word. People I knew through mutual connections told me about the shouting matches. Lisa screaming about how she gave up everything for Brian, and Brian snapping back that she had nothing left to give. The financial strain only made things worse. Without steady income, they were forced to cut back on everything. Lisa, who once wouldn't be caught dead in anything less than designer brands, had to sell her handbags, jewelry, and other luxuries just to scrape together enough cash to cover bills. Watching her prized possessions disappear one by one must have been a blow to her ego, but she didn't have a choice. Even basic groceries became a struggle for them. At one point, I heard through a mutual friend that Lisa was borrowing money from distant relatives just to keep the electricity on. The humiliation of asking for help after burning so many bridges must have stung. But again, she didn't have a choice. For me, after this long battle, what mattered the most is that I gained full custody of Jake, Mia, and Ellie. It wasn't just a victory in court. It was a step toward giving my kids the stable, loving home they deserved. Lisa's drinking had been a major factor in the decision. Greg, my lawyer, made sure the court understood the severity of her problem. He presented everything: the late nights, the missed milestones, and the countless times she'd stumbled home, too far gone to even acknowledge the kids. We had receipts, both literal and figurative. Her rehab stint, the relapses, and her continued erratic behavior painted a clear picture of someone who couldn't prioritize being a parent. During the custody hearing, Lisa tried to play the victim. She cried on the stand, claiming I'd painted her unfairly and that she was working on herself. But the evidence was overwhelming. The judge wasn't buying her act. To say she didn't take it well would be an understatement. After the ruling, Lisa confronted me in the hallway outside the courtroom. "You think you're so perfect," she hissed. "You've turned the kids against me." I stayed calm. "No, Lisa, you did that all on your own. I'm just making sure they don't have to suffer because of your choices." From that point on, Lisa's time with the kids was limited to supervised visitation. The court appointed a supervisor to ensure she didn't step out of line during her visits, And even then, she couldn't hold it together. Her drinking had never truly stopped. She'd show up late, or not at all, and when she did manage to arrive, she was often a shadow of the woman she pretended to be. The kids noticed. Jake, now old enough to understand what was going on, started refusing to attend visits. "Why should I go, Dad?" he asked me one day. "She doesn't even care about us. She's just there because she has to be." Mia and Ellie were more forgiving, but even they began to distance themselves. They'd tell me about how Lisa would spend half the visit scrolling on her phone or complaining about her terrible life. One time, Mia came home and said, "Mom told me she wishes she could come back to live with us. She said she misses you, Dad." It wasn't the first time I'd heard that. One day during a supervised visit, Lisa cornered me in the parking lot as I was dropping the kids off. The supervisor was inside with the kids, and Lisa saw her chance. "Please," she said, her voice shaking. "I can't do this anymore. Brian's useless. He's lost everything, and I'm barely hanging on. I made a mistake, okay? I know that now. Just let me come home. We can fix this." I stared at her, almost in disbelief. "Fix this?" I repeated. "Lisa, there's nothing to fix. I'm not going to rebuild my life just to let you tear it down again." She grabbed my arm, tears streaming down her face. "I'll stop drinking. I'll go back to therapy. I'll do anything. Please, for the kids." It would have been easy to feel pity for her. She looked so small, so defeated. But then I remembered all the nights I'd stayed up cleaning up her messes, all the excuses she'd made, all the times she'd chosen herself over our family. I pulled my arm away. "The kids are fine," I said firmly. "They don't need you to fix anything. They need stability, something you've never been able to give them. So no, Lisa, this is over. You need to figure out your life without me." The look on her face was one of pure devastation. She opened her mouth to say something, but I turned and walked away before she could. From then on, Lisa's attempts to win me back became more pathetic. She'd send long, rambling texts about how she still loved me and wanted to make things right. She'd try to call late at night, only for me to send her to voicemail. Once, she even showed up outside the house, claiming she just wanted to talk. I told her through the intercom to leave before I called the police. Over time, her pleas became less frequent. I think she finally realized I wasn't going to budge. So yeah, that's pretty much how it all went down. Lisa thought she could screw around, neglect the kids, and still somehow come out on top. But oops, she didn't. Now, I've got the kids, the house, and a life that's finally drama-free. Meanwhile, she's stuck living with the mess she made. Do I feel bad? Not even a little. She made her choices and now she gets to deal with them. As for me, I'm finally at peace and it feels damn good.